한번 해주시죠.
All right. We're going a little bit quick, which is not what I'm allowed to do, but okay. I think we were here. We had been looking at breathing and tidal volumes. So we are looking at a process where the first step is I'm trying to get oxygen out of the lungs and into the bloodstream. All right, remember that we've got a very large surface area. We opened up all the alveoli. So those little sacs create a big surface area for us that helps to promote diffusion of the gases backwards and forwards across the respiratory membrane, and the gap between the membrane of the alveoli, one cell, membrane of the capillary, one cell, so we've got a very short diffusion distance there, all right? And we also have pressure differences, which direction is everything going to flow from? Where? Remember our car on the hill? I flow from an area of high to an area of low. All right. So pressure differences are helping here as well. Partial pressure is the term that we use for the amount of the pressure that's due to a particular gas. So we're looking mostly at partial pressure of oxygen, but we'll also discuss a little bit about carbon dioxide. And the total pressure of a gas mixture is the sum of all the partial pressures. So if we look at the pressure at sea level, if I look at a barometer at sea level, then that's 590, I think, millimeters of mercury, and 105 of that is due to the oxygen, right? Henry's law, and you don't need to know these laws, right? You just want to be aware that they're the kind of theory behind what's happening. Henry's law just says that how much gas is dissolved in the fluid of the blood, so we're looking specifically at the plasma, depends upon on the temperature, on the pressure, partial pressure of the gas, and how soluble the gas is. Well, the solubility of oxygen doesn't change, right? So that's relatively stable. Temperature only changes a little bit. So the partial pressure becomes the big key. So let's have a look here. And it doesn't show up very well on the overhead, but this is in your book, so you'll be able to see it more closely. All right. Here's the atmosphere. And I've got a partial pressure of oxygen, 150. In my lungs, the partial pressure is 105. So it's not a great big gradient, but it's enough for oxygen to move out of the air and into the alveoli. If we look at the blood coming from the heart to the lungs, partial pressure is way, way down in the venous blood, right? So 40 in this example. So 40 to 105 is a very steep gradient that promotes passage of oxygen out of the lungs and into the bloodstream much more rapidly. Because I've got a big difference here. So when we look at it the other side, we've switched from 40 to 100 in this example. So my partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury. I've got a lot more oxygen in the bloodstream as I leave the lungs. Right? So they did their job. Come round to the heart. Remember, the heart doesn't take oxygen from the blood that is inside it. So when it leaves the heart, it's still at the same level. And then we get down to the tissue. We'd be looking specifically at muscle tissue. So when I get down to the tissue, what I need is a high-low from the bloodstream to the tissue so that the oxygen can move out of the bloodstream and into the tissue. And remember our AVO2 difference. Okay? If I look at what I have here versus what I have here, that would tell me how much oxygen got dropped off. Okay? So we have dropped off our oxygen, which drops the pressure down, goes back to the heart, circulates out of the heart back to the lungs, can pick up more oxygen again. Remember, the high-low isn't specific to the blood or the lungs. It depends upon the context. Okay. So here it's high, and here it's low. Okay. Here now it's high, and here it would be low. If I'm looking at carbon dioxide, then that picture is reversed. All right? If we had a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air, we'd be in trouble because we'd be breathing in carbon dioxide. But what we see is a very low pressure of carbon dioxide in the air. And so we don't breathe in carbon dioxide because it's actually higher in the lungs. Because we produced carbon dioxide by making ATP. And so we're transporting it back to the lungs as a waste product to breathe out. Right? So it's high in the lungs, low in the atmosphere. That means I can breathe it out. So blood flow through the lungs then, how fast my blood is going, if I look here, right, how quickly blood is flowing through this capillary network would play a role in how much oxygen is getting into the bloodstream. So more blood flow when I exercise and we open up the capillary network and we open up all the arteries and we're moving more blood flow. Remember we said we had that big reservoir of blood sitting in the veins because they're stretchy. So when we start to exercise, we've got that additional blood. We can start moving around the body to carry oxygen and nutrients to the muscles to make ATP. So I've got higher blood flow when I exercise, a lot more blood flowing through the lungs, and that increases the gas diffusion. Means I can pick up more oxygen. At the end of our electron transport chain, we want that oxygen sitting there in the tissue to pick up the hydrogen, make water, so that we can keep making ATP. So more gas diffusion is a good thing if I'm exercising. All right. Blood pressure in that pulmonary circulation is pretty low compared to the systemic pressure out in the limbs. So that means it's easier to move the blood back towards the lungs. And it also is a protective factor for the respiratory membrane because that's so delicate, it's just 2 cells thick, You want to, if we had really high blood pressure there, we'd be bursting that membrane all the time. So it acts, does kind of a double whammy for us. I cannot say this word.
Equilibration.
Equilibration. You have to emphasize the brain. Equilibration of oxygen. So remember on our car, right? We said if the car's parked on a flat surface and we take the handbrake off, what happens? Nothing, right? So sooner or later, if I've got a gradient and oxygen is pouring across that membrane, then as the oxygen moves across, the pressure goes up the other side. Sooner or later, I'm going to end up with the same pressure either side of the membrane, at which point the oxygen stops moving. That takes about 1/4 of a second at the lungs. Okay. So it doesn't take very long, but it's long enough for plenty of blood to move through and pick up oxygen. So each breath. That means then, as my blood flow increases, I have less time available because the blood's flowing through more quickly, but it's counterbalanced because we've got more volume. So that then acts to slow it down a little bit. So when we look at an individual who is moderately trained or sedentary, okay, then they don't have a lot of problems with the speed of blood flow getting to the point where it's moving through the lungs too fast for any oxygen to get picked up. Right? So for a sedentary person, or for a moderately trained person, this doesn't present a big problem. But when we look at a highly trained aerobic person, we start to see a few issues. So it gets really interesting. We don't create more capillary network in the lungs. So when we looked at the muscle tissue, we said that if we train really hard, one of the adaptations that we see is more capillaries, a larger capillary network. We grow additional blood vessels around the muscle tissue in order to deliver more oxygen and more nutrients. Okay? That doesn't happen when we look at the lung tissue. Doesn't matter how much you train, we don't increase blood flow via increasing the capillary network, we just speed it up. So at some point then, we hit a situation where for a highly trained person, that blood flow is moving so quickly, they actually see a drop in gas diffusion. Right? That all sounds a little bit weird right now, but when we start to look at what happens at altitude, this plays a role. Someone who is highly, highly trained aerobically has more problem with altitude than someone who is less trained, because they've already got an impact on their oxygen diffusion if they're running hard, right? Versus me. Okay? So that means that we can work, those of us that are moderate, can work at 4,000 feet and not get very much effect. I don't have a lot of trouble getting oxygen into my bloodstream at 4,000 feet. I have probably less trouble than someone who bikes a lot if we go up to 7,000 feet. I'm going to start struggling they might struggle even more. Right? It's just an odd, it's one of those very rare situations where the fitter you are actually seems to have a little bit of a negative impact. That doesn't happen very often in the body. Uh-oh, let's switch over to that one. All right, so we've got it out of the atmosphere into the lungs. We've got the oxygen out of the lungs and into the blood. Now we have to transport it down to the tissue that's working. Right? So when we look at oxygen transport within the blood, remember we've got plasma that makes up a large amount of our blood, watery substance. And then we have the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, all the other hematocrit in there. Okay? So, given that we've got so much water in our blood, it would be really, really helpful if we could dissolve a ton of oxygen in that water, but actually we can't. Okay? So very little of our oxygen transport is to do with the water in the bloodstream, but just a tiny amount manages to dissolve. Most of it then is getting carried around on the red blood cells, and we mentioned those before spring break. They've got a molecule of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is protein plus an ion. So iron becomes very, very important when we're looking at the transport of oxygen. Okay? Because if the hemoglobin is short on iron, it can't pick up oxygen as well. And it can't do its job properly if there's not enough iron available within the hemoglobin. The fancy terms, once the oxygen is on the hemoglobin and attached, oxyhemoglobin, and if it's a hemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen, we call it deoxyhemoglobin. The goal is to get as saturated with oxygen as possible. So I want as much of my hemoglobin carrying oxygen as I possibly can. So saturation is the most, if I'm 100% saturated, all my hemoglobin has oxygen attached to it. Right. So then, by step, how much hemoglobin I have then determines how much oxygen can be transported. So I've got to be making red blood cells, but I've got to be making red blood cells that have hemoglobin with iron, enough iron to do the job properly. Right? So sometimes that doesn't happen. And occasionally we get anemia, can either be iron deficient anemia or sports anemia. Right? Iron deficient anemia can occur because I don't have enough iron in my diet. So it could be an intake problem. I don't eat enough foods that are rich in iron. Some people eat foods that are rich in iron but have an absorption problem at in the digestion system. So they've got the iron, but they don't absorb it, and so it can't get built into the hemoglobin. Iron deficiency can occur if you hemorrhage badly. So if you have surgery or you have a car crash. Being pregnant can cause iron deficiency. Women, girls who have very, very heavy menstrual cycles sometimes will develop mild anemia. Okay. So any of those could cause an iron deficiency. Once I'm deficient in iron and it's impacting how well I can pick up oxygen, then it has an impact on aerobic endurance performance. Right? So, yes, ma'am.
So what if you have a problem with too much iron? Does that affect how blood transports?
I haven't heard that. Because if you had to me, if I've got enough to make all my hemoglobin, I would be able to transport the iron. Now, too much iron could have other effects. Pretty sure it would impact digestion. Maybe it impacts something like vitamin C absorption or something else that then gives you some health issues. But I'm not sure that it would change this picture. But I haven't ever read that. Okay, so oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Blah, big long word, right? And the book goes into a lot of detail when you're looking at this curve. I think the most useful thing about the curve, it gives us a picture why the hemoglobin can bind to oxygen and release oxygen at the right bus stop. If you think of hemoglobin and red blood cells as the bus, right? They're going to come trundling in to the lungs, and oxygen has to get onto the bus at the lungs. And then it's going to go trundling off out of the lungs, back to the heart, out of the heart, around the body, and at the right time, it's got to get off the bus in order for the muscle to use it to make ATP. Well, which muscle? When? How? Right? How do we control when the oxygen gets off again? Right? So this curve gives us a picture of that. So let me see if I can explain this. Up here, right, I'm looking at anywhere between 90 to 100, 105 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure for oxygen. We said that the partial pressure in the lungs is 105, right? So if I've got 105 millimeters mercury, I'm capable of completely saturating all my hemoglobin, right? So at 100, I've got 100% saturation. So, just so happens we have 105 gives us a little bit of flexi room. And the fact that this curve is a little bit flat here gives us a little bit more wiggle room, because that means I can drop down to 90 or so millimeters of mercury in pressure and still pick up almost 100% saturation of oxygen. So as I go higher up in altitude, right, to a point, physiological altitude is about 5,000 feet, so we're just under there. Right now, even though we're at 4,000 feet, and the partial pressure of oxygen is lower here than it would be in New York, okay, I can still get 100% saturation and do really good quality aerobic work. So those of you who are aerobic athletes or do any kind of aerobic work, you don't suffer a lot even though we're at quite high altitude here. Okay? So when we look down here, we've got very low partial pressure of oxygen and a low percentage of saturation. This is around the muscle tissue, it's moving out. And so partial pressure's dropping, saturation's dropping, so when we look at hemoglobin in the veins, it's not very saturated because it dumped the oxygen off at the tissue. So, curve allows me to drop plenty of oxygen off at the tissue, but it means I can pick up, it's just a picture. It's an interesting picture, I think, if you look at what happens when we exercise. When we exercise, we get hotter, right? Our temperature goes up within the muscle. It also goes up a little bit in the blood. Temperature goes up, it shifts this curve to the right. So if I shift it over here, look what happens. Right? For any given pressure of oxygen, partial pressure, I'm less saturated. So I was able to give away more oxygen. That means that when it's warm, I'm able to get off the bus faster, easier, simpler. So getting warm when we're exercising makes it easier for the oxygen to leave the bloodstream and get into the muscle tissue. Conversely, getting colder makes it harder. Right? But we don't see getting colder in the bloodstream during exercise. We get that if we were getting frostbite or something, okay, which is why tissues die if you get frostbite, because they can't get oxygen into the tissue. Okay. So temperature positively impacts the movement of oxygen into the muscle tissue. Acidity does the same thing. Right? The higher the acid, the more the shift to the right. So we see the same directional shift as the environment becomes more acidic. And when we exercise, even if we're exercising aerobically, the environment is more acidic than it is at rest. Right? It's less acidic aerobically than it would be anaerobically, but I've still got some hydrogen ions floating around, and I've still got some lactic acid getting made. Doesn't all get across into aerobic metabolism. Remember, we've always got that anaerobic ticking along underneath. Right? So when I exercise, I change the acidity level, and that also makes it easier for oxygen to leave the bloodstream and get into the muscle tissue. So the two things that occur environmentally when I exercise both help the oxygen get out of the bloodstream and move across to help me make ATP. Right? So all the other, so it can be a quite complicated discussion looking at this dissociation curve. I don't think we need more than that. Okay? If the curve shifts to the right, which is what happens when we exercise, all that is telling me is I've got more ability to get oxygen into the muscle tissue. Okay. Okay. So, oops. All right. So, just as high, low, okay? Capillary network. Okay. At the alveolus. So the blood is going to drop off carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen. Remember, it depends where the high and the low are. So if this is my red blood cell, let's make it simpler. Right? Here's lung. Here's muscle. Okay? If I'm talking about oxygen, right, then we want oxygen to go which way? Onto the red blood cell. Right? And then we want oxygen to come off the red blood cell. Does that make sense? So, where's high, where's low? Lung or red blood cell? Lung is high. Red blood cell is low. Don't get confused. The same amount of oxygen, because now this red blood cell has traveled around the body. Now which is high and which is low? Right? And if we look at carbon dioxide, we're going to make carbon dioxide in the muscle tissue when we're making ATP. We can't use carbon dioxide for anything as humans. It's a waste product. As far as we know right now, we don't utilize it for anything. So we've got to get it out of the body. Right? So I want to transport it, and then I want to offload it and breathe it out. So now we have a high and a low to move it that way. And then we're going to have a high to a low to move it into the lung tissue. And then as we looked, it's really low out in the atmosphere, makes it very easy to breathe it out. All right. So again, they have a very nice diagram, but I think it's more complicated than we need, right? If we had a whole year of exercise physiology, then we could look at the detail in the picture. But we don't get a whole year. So let's simplify it a little bit and at least get the right idea of how the mechanism is basically working. All right? So oxygen then jumps onto the hemoglobin, moves around the body, and comes off the hemoglobin at a point where partial pressure allows it to easily move out and into the muscle tissue. Right? When we look at carbon dioxide, we can transport carbon dioxide back. Some of it can dissolve, not very much. About 10% of the carbon dioxide just dissolves in the bloodstream. Right? About 20% or so can attach to the hemoglobin. It doesn't attach to the same part of the hemoglobin as the oxygen, so it doesn't interfere with carrying oxygen. But the hemoglobin can also move the carbon dioxide at the same time. So if it's picking up carbon dioxide at a rib muscle, and it's still got to go around to get back to the lungs, that's not a problem. Right? It doesn't block the oxygen. And then about 70%, so the vast majority of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate, so it moves into the bloodstream, disassociates to bicarbonate, can't remember my chemistry, gets around to the lungs, and the bicarbonate splits back and drops off the carbon dioxide. Right. So most of it gets moved around as bicarbonate. So we got it into the lungs, we got it into the bloodstream, we've got it to the muscle tissue, right? And the same rule applies. When I get to the muscle tissue, I have to have a pressure gradient to make it simple to move the oxygen. The steeper the gradient, the easier it is to move the oxygen across and into the muscle tissue. So we'll see this picture again in the chapter about when we're looking at altitude. But if you look here, it's 100 in the bloodstream. The partial pressure within the muscle tissue is only 40. There's not very much oxygen available when you're at rest in the muscle tissue, but a little bit. But that 60 difference is a nice strong gradient, makes it easy for me to chuck off oxygen when I need to, and then go back and pick up more. Right, so partial pressure gradients make the difference. Right, so now it's in the muscle. Anybody remember where in the muscle I'm going to use the oxygen to make ATP? Mitochondria. Right? So mitochondria probably isn't just happen to sit right by the membrane of the muscle. So we've got to move the oxygen across the muscle tissue to the mitochondria so that it can pick up the hydrogen and turn into water. All right? We have another protein-iron combination. This time we call it myoglobin because it's in the muscle, myo. All right? But it's a very similar molecule to a hemoglobin. All right? And it can attach the oxygen, and it doesn't exactly carry, it doesn't move across the membrane, but it acts as a stepping stone. It makes the distance from the membrane to the mitochondria shorter, right? So the oxygen can kind of step across rather than having to take one big step. It can take a smaller step to the myoglobin and then get across to the mitochondria from there. All right? So that's why they call it passive diffusion, because the myoglobin doesn't literally move across the muscle cell. Right? If myoglobin is involved in helping oxygen get to the mitochondria, which muscle fiber type has the most myoglobin? If myoglobin is involved in helping oxygen get across to the mitochondria to make ATP, type 1, right, because type 1 is my muscle fiber that I'm going to use for aerobic exercise. Right? So what we see is type 1 fibers have a much higher myoglobin content than either type 2 fibers, but type 2As have more myoglobin than a type 2X would have. So just think about, what do I know, right? I know I use slower motor units. Slower motor units have type 1 fibers. Type 1 fibers are really good at aerobic work. Part of the reason they're really good It's because they've got more myoglobin available so they can move oxygen more easily. Myoglobin typically has some oxygen, so there'll be a little bit of oxygen sitting around in your muscle cells. Remember, right now you're working aerobically. If you start to work anaerobically, doesn't mean your aerobic metabolism shuts off, just means it isn't the predominant producer of ATP. So there's always a little bit of oxygen hanging around in the muscle cell on that myoglobin. When we talked about EPOC, right, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and we said one of the reasons we keep breathing hard when we finished exercising and we don't need to be breathing hard is because we have to replace the oxygen we stop. So when you first start switching over anaerobic to aerobic, I've already got a little bit of oxygen sitting in the cell to help that process. When I stop working, I've got to make sure I've got some oxygen sitting in the cell. Right? I've got to put it back what I borrowed at the beginning. So that's one of the reasons that feeds into, right, at the end of your exercising. All right, how much time have we got? Not very much. Okay. All right, ventilation then. We've been talking about the respiratory system. Okay. So we're talking about breathing. We're talking about the fact that when we start to exercise, how we breathe changes. Right? We breathe more deeply, and then if we need to, we start to breathe more rapidly. Okay. So there are several areas that are called respiratory control centers. And when we look in the brain, they're in the pons and the medulla. Right? So we have, they work like a pacemaker. Okay? So when you're sitting here, you're not thinking about breathing. Right? You're not consciously going, breathe in, breathe out. Right? We do it in yoga. We make our breathing very conscious when we take a yoga class. We do it when we jump into a swimming pool. We make our breathing very conscious when we jump into a swimming pool, so we don't get a great big lung full of water, right? We don't want to be breathing in water, so we hold our breath. 2-year-olds throw a tantrum and hold their breath. So we can override what is kind of subliminal, what is unconscious control of our breathing when we want to. But typically, these respiratory control centers just set a very rhythmical, if we measured you, if we filmed you and we watched it, your breathing is very rhythmical right now when you're at rest and you're breathing unconsciously. So when we need to breathe faster, when we start exercising, we can do that ourselves, but actually we don't have to. You're going to start breathing faster anyway. Okay? So, and that is controlled by chemoreceptors. We have chemoreceptors in the central nervous system. We also have chemoreceptors out in the peripheral nervous system. And they tell the brain, okay, I've got to start breathing deeper, breathing harder, right? The bicarbonate in your bloodstream tells you to breathe faster. So the chemoreceptors recognize this carbon dioxide that's dissolved, and I've got to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So I breathe faster. Does that make sense? So when you run, you don't technically breathe faster because you need more oxygen, although that does play a role. You have to breathe faster to offload the carbon dioxide that you've got building up in the bloodstream. When you watch swimmers, they use this mechanism very cleverly. Don't try it if you're a beginner. Don't try it with people who are learning to swim. Bad plan. But they deliberately hyperventilate. Has anybody ever hyperventilated? Very ugly. Very ugly. It's not a nice feeling at all. Right? When you hyperventilate, it's because you're breathing so quickly or you're breathing out very, very hard, and you create an imbalance in the carbon dioxide. Well, swimmers who want to dive, they are not aerodynamically because they're in the water, but aquadynamically, right? You're more streamlined under the water. So when they dive, they want to be able to stay under the water as long as possible and get as far down the pool as they can before they have to come up back to the surface, because then you've got surface tension on the water slowing you down, right? So they deliberately hyperventilate before a race. So if you watch a swimming race and watch what they're doing, they'll be going, breathing off, hard, sharp. Okay? They're not breathing in extra oxygen so they can hold their breath under the water. They're breathing out extra carbon dioxide to trick their brain into thinking it doesn't need to breathe. Very clever. Okay? Very clever. So we can trick it, but I wouldn't suggest trying it, because if you black out under the water, someone has to dive in and save you, and it will get very ugly.